So, in terms of comments people make regarding players, I see a lot of this guy's a loser and he'll never amount to anything. And or, oh yeah, he's good in the regular season, but in the playoffs he's crap. So, these are all the Stanley Cup winners over the last 20, 21 years. 2005 is, of course, not up here because there was no Stanley Cup champion that season due to the lockout. Go ahead and turn this a little bit. Nope, that's not going to work either. Hold this in a little closer. Don't you fall over. Don't you dare. Okay. So, I've had this idea for an award for a while. Shadow, you're really brave. I really hope they're sleeping. I've had this idea for an award for a while. The Larry Murphy Award. I'll go ahead and throw it up here. The Larry Murphy Award for me is... I swear I'm not having a seizure. So, yeah, I'll write it down here. I don't have to reach out so far. Larry Murphy, Hall of Fame career, and was booed out of Toronto. And Toronto fans said he was a loser, he was terrible, he was crap, he was slow, he was old, and went to Detroit and won a Stanley Cup. And ever since then, I've watched his players have been said to be one thing, and then they win a Stanley Cup. Now, to win this award, you don't have to be the reason your team wins the Stanley Cup. It's just you have to have your name on a Stanley Cup, so that the fan base somewhere twitches just a little seeing your name on the Stanley Cup, and they can say, "Oh, he was just a passenger," but they're wrong. And also, I'm including in this list players who either got traded from a team who had no idea what they were trading, or players who'd been with one team the whole way along and people have said, well, yeah, but you can't win with that player. That player can't win in the Stanley Cup playoffs. So 1996 is where I started, because 1995 I couldn't really come up with anybody. 1996 I thought was a very important year, and I'll share the award between two guys. Joe Sakic, it was said, had gone through a lot of losing in Quebec as a member of the Nordiques, and maybe the Nordiques would be better off trading him because he'd lost too much. Maybe he wasn't a winner. Patrick Roy, traded out of Montreal that year. He's washed up. I heard Montreal fans, he's washed up anyways. He's over the hill. He's a prima donna. He thinks he's bigger than the team. It's all right. This Thibault kid's gonna be really good anyways. We don't really need Roy. We got all these forwards and defensemen, and we don't need a star goaltender to win. Patrick Roy went to Colorado and made a big difference. While I was a big fan of Stéphane Fiset, and I was a fan of Jocelyn Thibault as well, Roy, head and shoulders above them, helped get Colorado to the promised land. Now, 1997, because it's his award, I kind of have to give this to Larry Murphy, don't I? But does he have to share it? Kind of. Because while Sakic was being told, you've lost too much and maybe they need to trade you before they can win a Stanley Cup, Steve Yzerman was hearing much the same thing in Detroit, except that Yzerman was a choker in the playoffs. Detroit was never going to win anything in the playoffs. Their starting goalie that year, I believe the first year, was Mike Vernon. In 1998, they won a Stanley Cup with a starting goaltender. And you know what's funny? I'm going to put Osgood up here, and people are going to say, oh, well, yeah, but Osgood won a Stanley Cup behind a really good team. I don't want to hear that. Because Osgood played really, really well that spring and summer. Osgood was very, very much his name the last syllable. He was good. He was great at times. And he stole games for Detroit. You can't win a Stanley Cup with a goaltender not stealing a single game. It doesn't happen in today's NHL, and it didn't happen in 98. So Osgood, starter, even though people said it couldn't be done. 1999 Dallas. The story here, I know, Buffalo fans are going to be mad, but Brett Hull, it was said when he came over from St. Louis, was never going to win anything. He was a me-first player. He didn't pass. All it was about was himself. He was selfish, he was kind of a prick, he was arrogant, and he was never going to win a thing. And the good thing they sent him to Dallas, because Dallas is never going to win anything either. Wrong. New Jersey. And again, this was a guy who came in and played a support role. But at the time that he got traded into New Jersey, Alex McGillney was at his lowest level. He'd come out of a disaster in Vancouver. His time in Vancouver, he had one really good year, and then the rest of the time was basically a muddled mess. And it wasn't his fault. The fault starts with mess and ends with yay. And McGillney, when he got to New Jersey, helped him win a Stanley Cup. Now, Vancouver fans weren't upset with getting Brendan Morrison in that deal, but McGillney got himself a Stanley Cup ring. And whether he scored 7 points in 20 games or not, and he did, you don't have to look it up, he was still a member of a Stanley Cup winner, and you can't take that away from him. 2001, Colorado. Well, there's only one guy to put up here, and it breaks me inside. It does, because as a Boston fan, Ray Bourque was the Bruins. And it was disastrous that the Bruins were never able to get him a Stanley Cup. Absolutely disastrous. So they had to trade him to get it. Sad. But he got it. And up until you win a Stanley Cup as one of the all-time greats, it will be an asterisk next to your name. Great player, never won a Stanley Cup. Mike Gartner is one of those guys. 2002. So coming out of 99... it wasn't Hasek's fault that Buffalo lost because Hasek got them to the final. But Hasek went to Detroit to prove he could win a Stanley Cup, and he did. And he was fantastic for Detroit in that Stanley Cup run. And I was never a Hasek fan, but he was fantastic during that run. Absolutely. Now, 2003, this is a guy who got traded. He got traded into New Jersey, and nobody thought a whole lot about it at the time, except for this Dallas Stars fan here was very upset to see him going. I thought about Jason Arnott, but Jamie Langenbrunner, yeah, all he did was get 12 goals in the playoffs, leading the team. Jamie Langenbrunner was, just for name alone, was a warrior. Absolutely fantastic player. Love Langenbrunner, just great. 2004, and your redemption story for a future Hall of Famer. The guy just got in now. Dave, greatest power play man ever, Andreychuk. Andreychuk was very, very good for Tampa. And while it didn't show on the score sheet, he was an emotional leader, and they couldn't hand him the Stanley Cup fast enough. Having that guy on the team that has never won a Stanley Cup can be a rallying cry for the team. 2006, so we're coming out of the lockout. We're into Carolina winning. And for me, it doesn't get any more important than the play of Rod Brind'Amour. Rod Brind'Amour was a very good player. I don't think he ever makes the Hall of Fame, but a good player. And he was fantastic during that run. Stanley Cup, nobody can take it away from him. As I've said with these guys up above, he gets the Larry Murphy Award that year. 2007. I had thought about Pronger, but I think we all knew what Pronger was because Pronger had won a Hart Trophy as a defenseman. Teemu. After Teemu went, like with Teemu's Colorado foibles and then San Jose, he had kind of an up-down thing. Solani winning that cup in 2007 is really what solidified him as one of the greatest players of his generation. And so Larry Murphy Award definitely goes to him on that one. 2008. Hey, look who's getting it again. This is the only two-time winner I could come up with. And it's funny because his time in St. Louis was unremarkable. His time in New York was unremarkable with the Islanders. Chris Osgood put up a 1.55 goals against average and a .930 save percentage. And if anybody's going to say, oh yeah, but that was behind Detroit's defense, so it doesn't matter, you're a hypocrite. You can't say that about a guy behind a Stanley Cup winning defense with Osgood and not say it about any other goaltender who's played behind a Stanley Cup defense. That includes Marc-Andre Fleury. That includes some other guys I'm going to talk about on this list. That includes Corey Crawford. Osgood was fantastic in the 2008 Stanley Cup playoffs. Played off his ass. He came in with something to prove, and he proved it. And yet, he's still not mentioned as a Hall of Famer. He won tons of games. But because he's perceived as having played behind one of the great teams of all time, the Stanley Cups don't matter, the wins don't matter, it doesn't seem like anything matters. You can point out any stat of Osgood's you want, people are still going to say, yeah, but he played in Detroit. So it doesn't matter. 2009, every great player is considered great, not all-time great until they win. So I'll give it to Crosby, and I thought about Malkin because Malkin scored more points, but Crosby is the higher threshold player. He is the one who is seen as the best player of those 10 years. And it really was solidified there. Because until you win a Stanley Cup as a great player, and ask Yzerman, ask Sakic, ask Gretzky, Bossy, you're going to be seen as great, but maybe you're not going to win that big game. Maybe you're not quite good enough to do it. So Crosby winning in 2009 was huge. 2010, everybody's whipping boy after Detroit, after Pittsburgh. Look, he keeps going to Stanley Cup teams, and they lose. Isn't it funny? Yeah, Marian Hossa went to Chicago, signed a 12-year contract. Played really, really well. And definitely gets the Larry Murphy Award there, because he signed a 1-year contract with Pittsburgh. They didn't do it. After he had a contract with Detroit, and they didn't do it. When he went to Chicago, everybody said, well, we know who's losing in the finals this year. It's going to be Chicago. Hossa proved him wrong. 2011, I like underdogs. To me, there's no underdog story better than Tim Thomas. Back in and around 07, 08, I noticed Thomas's stats in the minors were intimidating. And I noticed he was just kind of sitting out there, and then, he's Boston property, and I was like, I wish the Bruins would give him a shot. And they never quite did. Until they had to. Boston's hand was forced. They didn't want Thomas to be the starter. And then when he was the starter and he was pretty good, they're like, oh, okay, well, I guess it's a good thing Fernandez got hurt. Tim Thomas, to me, the ultimate underdog. Everybody remembers that great Stanley Cup run, and it was great. But it was some luck that got him there. 2012, we're getting into the more recent history, so now I can get into people arguing with me. It's a shared award again, because we heard a lot about how Jeff Carter and Mike Richards were alcoholics and partiers, and they were rebel rousers, and they were a problem for Philadelphia. And Carter went to Columbus, and Columbus didn't want him either, so Columbus traded him to L.A., and he was a prima donna in Columbus, and who the hell does this kid think he is? And then they won a Stanley Cup. And without Carter and Richards and that depth they provided, the Kings don't win that in 2012. Because even with what Quick was doing, and Jonathan Quick was fantastic, you had to have timely goals. And having guys like this in your lineup is key. 2013, and I'll admit, this pick is because both he scored 17 points in 23 games out of nowhere, which overinflated his value when his contract came up, and the fact that he is the emotional story of this year. So the Larry Murphy, you have no business winning a Stanley Cup. Oh, look, you're a key guy, Brian Bickle. Again, Chicago, Bickle, nobody expected that out of him. Nobody. I don't even think if you asked Bickle, I don't even know if Bickle would have expected that out of himself. Bickle, fantastic player that spring, and played a large role in Chicago getting back to that Stanley Cup. 2014. There's a lot of talk about how the Kings have cap problems. Marian Gabourik's a part of that problem. Well, when Gaborik was brought in as a deadline pickup by LA, I don't think a whole lot was expected of him, and he had a really good run, and they won the Stanley Cup. This is why when people talk about, well, the Kings have all these problems with cap, yeah, but I can understand why. Because Carter and Gaborik, two key guys who got him Stanley Cups, and both of these Stanley Cups Dustin Brown played a major role in. So it is hard to argue against a GM wanting to keep a team together that won 2 Stanley Cups. Can we from the outside see that there were problems and maybe he should have let some guys go? Absolutely. But I can understand why a GM like Lombardi would want to remain loyal to the guys who got him 2 Stanley Cup rings. 2015. You know what? This is gonna get some people. Because if you're not paying attention to the entire Stanley Cup run for the Blackhawks in 2015, Scott Darling may slip by. Crawford wasn't doing particularly well. Scott Darling came in, played 5 games, 1 in relief, was 3-1, and had a .936 save percentage. Scott Darling, that was his coming out party. This is why he's a starter for Carolina next year. It starts here. Without Darling bailing out Crawford, Blackhawks go out in the first round. Crawford gets his game together. They wait till Darling has a loss. Crawford goes back in. Crawford wins the rest of the way. And it's easy to forget that without Darling, they don't win that Stanley Cup. 2016. Well, everybody should know who the story was that year. And people still argue he should have won MVP. And before the final, Phil Kessel would have been the MVP. But in the final, Crosby just took over. Crosby ran the ice. That was his show. And Kessel was the number 1 point scorer, certainly. But I tell you, it's quite the story. Because Toronto, it's not that long ago, Toronto fans were handing out these posters just on paper. Have you seen me? Like missing child posters of Phil Kessel. Last seen, and I think they had up the last time he had a goal or the last time he had a multi-point game. And it was entertaining. I found it funny. Because I was never a Phil Kessel fan while he was in Toronto either. But it turns out when you give him a role that he's a secondary player, he excels. When he's not the key guy and he's not counted on to be the number 1 guy, he excels. 2017. So the playoffs we just finished. I'm going to go and go with the emotional moment again. Marc-Andre Fleury. Fleury was left for dead after 2016. Everybody expected Fleury to be gone before the season. Then everybody expected Fleury to be gone during the season. Then they expected him to be gone at the trade deadline. Then they thought, well, maybe Fleury will get moved before the expansion draft. No. Fleury took his medicine. And he took his medicine in February. So while he was helping Pittsburgh get over the loss of Matt Murray and leading them to the Stanley Cup final, he already knew his time in Pittsburgh was probably over. I can't think of a more Larry Murphy type thing than to go, all right, I got to put this team on my back when nobody expects it. And Larry Murphy didn't have to do that in Detroit. But I qualified as his award because it was the first time that I could remember that I saw a guy just get talked about that much by a fan base saying, this guy sucks, he's terrible. And then he plays a relatively key role in the Stanley Cup. Patrick Waugh, for me, doesn't get the award named after him because we all knew Patrick Waugh was still a great goalie. We just didn't know how great. I don't know that I was surprised Colorado won that Stanley Cup, but I was surprised at just how fantastic Waugh was from the moment he got into an Avs uniform. He is, to this day, I would put him up there with Billy Smith, Ron Hextall, Mike Vernon, surprisingly. Goalies who really, really competitive, get really, really fired up and really angry. Thomas goes in there too. And it was like from the moment he got to Colorado, he was bound and determined to prove that Montreal screwed up. And they screwed up badly by trading him. And he proved it, and he won 2 Stanley Cup rings. And they didn't win after he retired. And there's a connection there. Anyways, let me know any picks you guys have for these awards. Remember, he has to be a cast-off from another team who's forgotten, a support player who out of nowhere helps a team win a Stanley Cup, or boot off of a previous team and then wins a Stanley Cup, that kind of thing. So it's an interesting idea. I know that the Larry Murphy Award will never exist in reality, just like I know the Rod Langway Award never exists in reality. But it's nice to have an award. So thank you very much for watching the first ever Larry Murphy Award show, or video, or however we want to call it. Let me know your picks. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. And thank you so much for watching. And there you go. Completely nuts. So if anybody wants to say that this list is wrong, yeah, well, I'm completely nuts. I'm the yellow nut that the red guy is pointing at, so it's fine. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you guys again soon.